During the Gilded Age, the spectacle of wealth reached heights that almost defy imagination. Balls and dinner parties were not simply social gatherings, they were staged productions of power, wealth, and cultural dominance. An evening's festivities could consume the modern equivalent of $10 million, a sum so astronomical that it symbolized the widening gap between America's industrial barons and the working class struggling to survive. It was a period when extravagance became a weapon, a display meant not only to dazzle but also to intimidate. And while the privileged few danced under the glow of gaslit chandeliers, sipping champagne from crystal glasses, the majority of Americans lived in tenements, often crammed 5 or 6 to a room. The contrasts of this age were not just striking, they were explosive. The term Gilded Age itself was coined in 1873 by Mark Twain and Charles Dudley Warner, who observed that the era was not truly golden, but merely gilded. Gold leaf, after all, is only a thin covering. Beneath it often lies something far less valuably iron, stone, or even rot. And in the same way, beneath the glitter of New York society lay a world of political corruption, violent labor strikes, and grinding poverty. Nowhere was this paradox more visible than in the banquets of New York's elite. At the Vanderbilt mansions on Fifth Avenue, guests dined on menus that stretched to 22, sometimes 60 elaborate courses. Filet de boeuf, chicken laced with truffles, lobster Newburg, turtle soup, and delicate aspics were laid out in quantities that mocked hunger itself. Each dish was less about nourishment and more about spectacle. Each menu a declaration that wealth itself had become the new American aristocracy. At one such ball in January 1888, 200 of New York's wealthiest gathered under the roof of Mrs. Cornelius Vanderbilt, while ordinary families on the Lower East Side struggled to secure bread and coal. These guests were entertained by a modest spread of 22 dishes. Modest, of course, only by the standards of the very rich. Among the final offerings that night was the shimmering jewel of the table, Au Fruitzer champagne jelly, studded with the fruits of the season, a dish designed as much for visual splendor as for taste. Such delicacies were far more than desserts. They were symbols of power, testaments to the ability to command resources that ordinary people could not dream of. Iceboxes were rare and costly, meaning that in summer months, to serve a chilled champagne jelly was to demonstrate dominance over the seasons themselves. To serve one was to proclaim, "I can control nature because I can afford to buy it." But these glittering tables of abundance carried a deeper political meaning. They were stages for what economist Thorstein Veblen would later call conspicuous consumption, spending not to satisfy need, but to broadcast wealth. In an era of violent strikes at Carnegie's steel mills and bloody clashes between Pinkerton guards and miners, the banquets of the rich became a form of silent propaganda. They reminded everyone, invited or not, of who truly ruled America. And yet, these gatherings were more than just culinary pageants. They were the arenas where social hierarchies were cemented, where fortunes could buy a place among the so-called 400, the list of New York's most fashionable families, compiled by social arbiter Ward McAllister. At these dinners, alliances were formed, reputations built, and rivalries sharpened. Every chandelier that glittered, every course that arrived with military precision, was another reminder that wealth had become the new nobility in America's Gilded Empire. The Gilded Age was not just a time of extravagant dining. It was a theater where wealth became performance. Each banquet was a carefully scripted act of cultural dominance, a tableau of privilege staged against the backdrop of America's rapid industrial transformation. railroads, steel, oil, and finance had created a new class of industrial titans, Rockefeller, Carnegie, Vanderbilt men, whose fortunes dwarfed those of European aristocrats. But in a republic with no dukes, no kings, and no inherited titles, wealth alone had to create its own nobility. And so it did, at the dinner table. Menus became weapons of prestige. A hostess could demonstrate her refinement not only by the number of dishes offered, but by their elegance, their complexity, and the sheer difficulty of producing them. Consider the champagne jelly, simple in appearance, yet demanding in execution. To craft such a dish in the 1880s required access to expensive gelatin, imported fruits, and most critically, vast amounts of ice. Before refrigeration was widespread, ice was harvested in winter from frozen lakes and stored in insulated warehouses, then sold at a premium. A molded jelly in July was not just dessert, it was a statement of economic power, a declaration that you could literally bend the seasons to your will. The dishes served at Vanderbilt's gatherings reveal the duality of the age. On one hand, there was artistic culinary creations that rivaled sculpture, designed as much for the eye as for the palate. On the other, there was excess, fried croquettes of sweetbreads, ham aspics, turtle soup enriched with Madeira, and beef fat threaded with lard to intensify richness. Meals were often served after midnight, heavy with butter and oil, in a society where indigestion was a badge of luxury. While the working poor calculated how to stretch pennies for bread and coal, the wealthy embraced the extravagance of eating foods that most would never taste in their lifetimes. But beyond indulgence, these meals carried an unmistakable political undertone. They marked the boundary between the ruling elite and everyone else. To dine with the Vanderbilts was not merely to enjoy fine food, it was to enter the sanctum of America's ruling class. Access to these tables signified more than social privilege. It was a form of economic validation, proof that your wealth had bought you entry into the highest echelon of New York society. The chandeliers, the silverware, the endless bottles of imported champagne all functioned as silent declarations that America had built its own aristocracy, one as dazzling and ruthless as Europe's nobility. It was also no coincidence that the language of these menus was French. To inscribe a menu in English would have been gauche, provincial. French was the tongue of sophistication, of Parisian haute cuisine, the cultural capital that every American millionaire aspired to imitate. A dinner menu, printed in elegant French typeface on embossed cardstock, was as much a signal of refinement as the food itself. Guests kept these menus as souvenirs, proof of their presence at history's most exclusive tables. And while the elites dined under gaslit ceilings, the political reality outside those gilded walls was dark. America was experiencing one of the most turbulent moments in its history. Labor strikes erupted across the nation. Immigrants crowded into slums, and corruption ran through the veins of politics. Yet, within the mansions of Fifth Avenue, champagne flowed as though the hardships of millions were but a distant rumor. The contrast was not merely economic, it was moral. The conspicuous abundance of the few became a provocation to the many, a visual reminder of inequality so stark it seemed unsustainable. Even the deserts spoke of this imbalance. Fruits preserved in brandy, berries imported across oceans, and wines aged in French cellars, all arranged into glittering gelatin molds, were not simply food, but declarations of power. They symbolized a system in which luxury was built upon the exploitation of labor. Every sip of champagne, every slice of aspic, was underwritten by the sweat of miners, steelworkers, and factory hands. To the elite, such meals were joy. To the masses, they were insult. And yet, the rich relished their role as trendsetters. They embraced conspicuous consumption, a phrase coined in this very era to describe the deliberate display of wealth for social advantage. Balls, feasts, and masquerades were not merely entertainment. They were the social currency of the Gilded Age. And as the Vanderbilts and their peers danced until dawn, America itself teetered between opulence and unrest, its golden facade concealing the iron tensions beneath. As the Gilded Age unfolded, New York society became obsessed with the idea of spectacle. The dining table was no longer a place for nourishment. It was a stage upon which fortunes were paraded. At the center of this theater stood the social arbiters, men and women who defined who was in and who was not. None was more influential than Ward McAllister, the self-proclaimed guardian of taste, and his ally Caroline Astor, the grande dame of New York high society. McAllister famously declared that there were only 400 truly fashionable people in New York, the so-called 400. To be counted among them was to be recognized not merely for wealth, but for legitimacy. A fortune made in railroads or oil was not enough. One had to perform refinement, to demonstrate mastery of etiquette, cuisine, and style. And what better proof than a dinner where 25 courses flowed seamlessly from raw oysters to game birds, from sorbets floating in champagne to towering gelatin molds shimmering under candlelight. These banquets were not casual affairs. They were meticulously choreographed. Waiters moved like clockwork, serving courses with military precision. Menus were curated as works of art, and the order of courses reflected a kind of culinary hierarchy: oysters to awaken the appetite, soups to soothe it, roasts to satisfy it, punches to refresh it, and sweets to delight it. Each dish arrived not in isolation, but as part of a grand narrative designed to overwhelm the senses. At one Vanderbilt gathering, the guests faced a menu of 22 dishes, a light spread compared to others of the era, where 50 or 60 dishes might appear. Among them was the of fruits in champagne jelly, a dessert that sparkled as both delicacy and status symbol. Recipes of the time, recorded by culinary figures like Charles Francatelli, chef to Queen Victoria, reveal how such dishes were elevated with liqueurs like kirsch or maraschino. Every ingredient spoke of wealth: imported spirits, rare fruits, French wines. Even the color of the jelly was a choice made for effect, with cochineal dye derived from crushed insects, fused to tint jellies a vivid red or pink. It was less about taste than about presentation. But beneath this glitter, critics saw decadence. In her 1877 book, Practical Cooking and Dinner Giving, Mary Henderson observed that Americans often mistook vulgar abundance for hospitality. To her, the endless parade of dishes was not refinement, but excess. Her words cut to the heart of the Gilded Age, the difference between golden elegance and gilded extravagance. And yet, for the elite, abundance was the point. To waste food was not shameful, but fashionable. Half-eaten plates returned to the kitchen were silent proof that the hosts could afford to throw away what others would kill to taste. The social stakes were enormous. A successful dinner could elevate a family's standing. A failed one could ruin it. For those clawing their way into society, like the Vanderbilts, new money, with old ambitions dinning, was a weapon. They knew that the gatekeepers, like Astor and McAllister, would not be impressed by fortunes alone. They demanded theater. And so, the Vanderbilts built mansions in the French chateau style, staged balls with guest lists that rivaled royal courts, and crafted menus that could hold their own against Versailles itself. Yet this pursuit of legitimacy often bordered on the absurd. Guests dressed not merely in gowns but in costumes, costing thousands of dollars, what would now equal tens of thousands. Alice Vanderbilt once appeared at a ball in an electric light dress, her gown wired with a battery to illuminate a glowing light bulb. A technological novelty turned into fashion. Others, like Kate, fearing strong, pushed eccentricity to its limits, wearing a cat costume complete with taxidermied feline. These displays may seem comical now, but at the time they were deadly serious. They were investments in social capital, wagers placed in the casino of high society. And all the while, outside those glittering ballrooms, the city seethed. Just blocks away from Fifth Avenue, tenement families lived without sanitation, heat, or hope. Strikes turned violent in factories, anarchist movements grew in strength, and politicians lined their pockets with bribes. The dinners of the rich were more than indulgences. They were provocations. They illustrated in real time the widening canyon between classes, a canyon that, if pushed too far, threatened to erupt into unrest. To the elite, however, the risks were worth it. For them, to host a ball was to cement one's dynasty, to stake a claim in the fragile hierarchy of America's self-made aristocracy. And so the food kept flowing, the champagne kept pouring, and the jelly molds kept wobbling under candlelight, even as the foundations of American society trembled beneath the weight of inequality. By the 1880s, the Gilded Age dinner party had evolved into something almost unrecognizable to earlier generations of Americans. What had once been a modest gathering with a few hearty dishes was now a full-scale production that blurred the line between culinary art and social warfare. Every plate carried meaning, every glass of champagne signaled rank, and every invitation was a passport into awe, out of the inner circle of power. The Vanderbilts, still seen as new money despite their astronomical fortune, understood this better than anyone. When Alva Vanderbilt, wife of William K. Vanderbilt, threw her now legendary masquerade ball in 1883, it was not merely a party, it was a declaration of dominance. Alva knew that Caroline Astor, the reigning queen of New York society, had long kept the Vanderbilts at arm's length, dismissing them as upstarts. But Alva also knew the secret of the age. Exclusion could be broken not by wealth alone, but by spectacle so grand it forced recognition. The masquerade was unprecedented in scale. Invitations, engraved in gold, were sent to only the most select names, though notably, one was withheld from Mrs. Astor's daughter. The insult was deliberate and effective. Astor, realizing that her own child could not miss the event of the decade, was forced to formally acknowledge the Vanderbilts. In one evening, Alva had not only staged the most extravagant ball New York had ever seen, costumes, orchestras, banquet tables groaning with food, she had seized her place at the pinnacle of society. Food at such events was not simply consumed, it was displayed. Entire tables became edible landscapes. There were pea-shaped like castles, roasts mounted on silver platters the size of doors, pyramids of candied fruit stacked to the ceiling. Ice sculptures carved from blocks hauled from distant lakes glittered in candlelight, dripping slowly as the evening wore on. Sorbets appeared in every imaginable flavor, meant to cleanse palates overwhelmed by the excesses of turtle soup, quail, venison, and foie gras. And always the wines. Champagne flowed without restraint, while European vintages were uncorked, as if they were water from a common well. To dine at such a table was to step into a living symbol of America's transformation. This was not a nation imitating Europe. It was a nation declaring itself its equal or, in its ambition, perhaps its superior. French chefs were imported. French phrases dominated menus. French etiquette dictated service. But beneath it all was something distinctly American. The audacity to take the traditions of old aristocracies and inflate them to colossal proportions. For the working classes, reports of these feasts, published in newspapers eager to sell tales of glamour, were both intoxicating and infuriating. To the struggling immigrant packed into a Lower East Side tenement, the idea of champagne jellies and glowing ball gowns must have seemed almost surreal. The same city that starved their children also hosted dinners where untouched roasts were discarded without a second glance. It was a paradox so glaring that it fueled a growing sense of injustice, one that would, in time, find its voice in the labor movements and populist politics of the late 19th century. Yet, among the elite, such critiques were largely ignored. For them, the stakes of social competition outweighed any moral unease. A dinner was not merely a meal, it was a weapon in the battle for supremacy. And in that battle, no expense was too great. If a cake cost the equivalent of a year's wages for a factory worker, so be it. If an imported wine took months to arrive by ship, it was worth it. If a dish required the labor of dozens of servants to prepare and serve in perfect synchronicity, it was not an inconvenience, but a necessity. The psychology of the age demanded it. To be seen as anything less than extravagant was to risk being forgotten, cast aside in a social world that thrived on novelty and excess. The Vanderbilts knew this. The Astors knew it. Every industrial magnate who sought entry into New York society knew it. And so the cycle of spectacle continued, each party striving to outshine the last, each menu more ambitious, each ballroom more dazzling. The irony was palpable. In a nation founded on democratic ideals, the upper crust had built its own monarchy not of blood, but of money. Its crown jewels were not scepters or thrones, but champagne, flutes, and French menus embossed in gold leaf.